Interviewed by James Barry Bingham on April the 13th, 1985. This is the story about a history of a small legacy. A legacy created by my parents, Walter Newton Bingham and Elise Nethery Bingham. And this is my father, Walter Newton Bingham, and behind us is the Bingham Farm, which they have owned for many years. Dad, what's the history of this farm and how you and Mother happened to come to have it today?
Well, the history begins in 1881 when my grandfather, Jonas Marion Ingram, bought this from his brother Mac Ingram. And I'm not real sure how many acres the original tract consisted of, but it did consist of the farm that we own, Elise and I own now. And in 1910, my grandfather, Jonas Marion Ingram, and his wife, Nancy Jane Ingram, deeded my mother the farm just back of us here, which consisted of about 88 acres. And the deed called for my father and mother to pay my grandfather and grandmother $100 each year so long as either lived. And this payment continued until 1932 when my grandmother died. And at that time, my mother inherited the 8.7 acres of land, which we can see just to the front of us over here, where Elise and I originally intended to build a house for our retirement age. And Elise, when my mother died in 1947, well, Elise and I bought the farm from my brother and my three sisters, and we paid $10,000 for it. And we're very proud of this investment, and hopefully we can continue to improve it and keep it in the family for many years to come.
The camera is now pointing towards the 8.7 acres located just away from the farm. Dad, what's the history of that?
Okay, this was part of a 50-acre tract of land which was level and all in one field, and was known as the Big Field by the family and throughout Murray County. And when my grandmother Ingram died in 1932, this 50 acres of land was divided four ways. My Aunt Mary received half of it, the 25 acres. Uncle Joe received a third of the other 25 acres. Uncle Charlie a third, and my mother a third. And the acreage you're looking at is the third that my mother inherited, and it was part of the purchase that Elise and I made from my mother's estate in 1947. And it's where we intended to build our house, and we're still developing it as a living place to build a house, in the future. We intend to keep this 8.7 acres as a possible building site, and if we don't use it in our lifetime, well, it'll be continued to develop it for future use and as a real asset to our family. Has city water to it now, and telephone, lights, and paved road on one side and a good gravel road on the other side.
We have turned the camera around from the farm and are now looking at the Booker place. Dad, what's the history of the Booker place?
Well, the Booker place is the original house that was purchased in 1881 by Jonas Marion Ingram and his wife Nancy Jane. And they moved there when my mother was 8 years old and continued to live there until their death. And when my grandmother Ingram died in 1932, my brother Herbert, my sister Martha, and I came over here to live with Aunt Mary, who was a semi-invalid. This is my mother's sister. And we lived there, and Herbert and I went to school at Cullioca in 1932. Walking, by the way, from this house to Cullioca, which is about 2 miles away, except sometimes we rode a horse, which it wasn't needed in the fields. And the house after let's stop that time. After my grandmother's death in 1932, the house went through a history of change. First, Aunt Mary had it being alone while she had an adopted daughter to come and live with her for a while. And the house gradually went down to where it became almost impossible to live in it. The roof was leaking and the floors were bad in some parts of the house. And addition was about to fall in, and it was actually abandoned. But in 1960, my cousin Dan Ingram bought this house from my Aunt Mary, and he undertook a restoration of the house and has done a remarkable job. And today it's recognized as one of the most outstanding early 1800 houses in Murray County. It's on the historic tour each year, and I enjoy showing it. And everybody who comes out here remarks that it's the most livable house on the tour, in that the rooms are small and well arranged, and the rest, it's in marked condition, just absolutely perfect in every way. The site you're looking at now is where the house was when Mother and Daddy was deeded this piece of property. And in the beginning it was just a two-room boxwood type house, and soon after they took possession of it in 1910 they expanded it to a five-room house, and it was a fairly nice place. But being in Arkansas as teachers, and then when Elise and I inherited, we're back at the five, and it was in this house where most of us was born. My sister Marilla, who is the oldest child, was actually born in Louisiana, where Mother and Daddy were teaching school. And Martha, the next child, was born in Booker Place. But my brother Herbert and myself and my sister Rachel were born in this house after it had been improved. And during the years that Elise and I were in Idaho, and even before that, the house was badly neglected, termite infested. And when we came back from Idaho, we saw no way to restore it to a livable house. So we tore it down with the hopes of building a newer house at this location. Okay, the barn you're looking at now was built by my mother and father about 1916. It's about the same age as I am, which means it's 70 years old. And the center part of it, which you're looking at as being framed, was the original barn. The shed on the north was built as a dairy project many, many years ago. My father and mother ran a dairy herd out there. Only what they built kind of disintegrated and fell down, and Elise and I reconstructed it since we've been back from retirement, back from Idaho. Now the south part of the shed was also built by Elise and I before we went to Idaho, and it was also used as part of a dairy farm that we had out here at the time. Now the corral you see on the south side was also built since we've been back from Idaho. This is in good condition today. We've put some new foundation under part of it. It's got a good roof on it, and we plan to keep it in good condition and use it now as for storage of hay and possibly curing of tobacco, should we raise tobacco on this farm. Okay, the barn was built by Ace Ingram and Nathan Ingram, and the tenant house that's you see in the distance there was also built by them at about the same time. And it's a little two-room house with a loft in it, and it's where the people who helped to farm the place live. And it's been restored somewhat since Elise and I have been back from Idaho, and we now use it for storage. We have some old furniture up there and quite a bit of walnut lumber stored in it. It's got a good roof on it, good foundation, and we'll continue to use it for storage. It's of course not livable. What you're looking at now is where the house was. And the spring that we're going to talk about now is about 30 yards in front of the house. And the history of this is that back in about 1919 or 1920, why, there was some water flowing out of a sinkhole here. My mother and father recognized it as a possible spring to furnish water for the house, and they got some help to come in and dig a hole in here, and they found a fairly good stream of water, rocked it up, had steps going down into the bottom of it. And then there was a concrete basin down here, which was used as a refrigerator back in those days, where they would put their milk and butter and other perishable foods. Come get them at mealtime, and after meal bring them back. And it was the only refrigeration the farm had, only refrigeration the household had. And of course, this was common throughout the country at that time on the farm. We're going to see now the location of the old house where I was born in 1915, the barn and the creek. By the way, there's enough waterfalls in this creek that you can hear it at the house. It was good to put you to sleep at night. And you get a fairly good the fields surrounding the house, and a real good view of Booker Place, which is where my mother was raised, of course, and then from where I was born. And look a little bit further through, you see the Bingham barn, and there was a shed on the side where it looks so rusty right now. There was no mule shed, and they made a lot of their money by raising and breaking mules to sell for farm purposes. Now you see in the family garden, it's one that we're using today, and has always been a garden place since childhood, since my childhood. Very rich land, produces well. Example of some of the experimenting we are doing with growing trees on this farm for future generations. The little pine you see here is an improved variety that came from Arkansas, and it's 3 years old now, and we've put about 10 in here, and you can see several of them that's doing remarkable growth. And I think they will mature in 20 to 25 years for sawwood, being about 14 inches in diameter. You're looking at some of the native walnut trees on the farm, and they're just south of where the old house used to be. These two trees are located at almost exactly 21 feet apart and are now 16 to 20 inches in diameter at breast height, just good sawlog size. The only fault you find with these trees is you do not have a 17 nut-free sawlog, and in our plantation we'll keep these limbs trimmed to give a 17-foot sawlog plus the crown that you see to bear walnuts. And these trees are good producers, and some of the trees we've planted came from nuts off of these trees. Okay, you're looking up an old road that was in use in 1921 and perhaps as late as 1922. And I remember coming down in front of the house and picking up mail when the mailman would come by in the horse and buggy. For certain now, these walnut trees that we're looking at have grown since 1922. And again, of course, they're native trees, and the only fault you find with these are that some of them do not have a 17-foot sawlog. But these are heavy producers of walnuts. In fact, in 1983, you could park under one of these trees and just open the truck door and fill a bushel basket of walnuts. They were just as thick as could be on the ground. Just no problem at all to gather all you wanted. A truckload or two could come from under those 5 trees you were looking at. The brush that you see in the roadway is some of the recreation activity that I have enjoyed, cleaning up the overgrown trees. And you can see some of the stumps where we've cut firewood, and perhaps in the distance you can see more brush where we've cleaned up a fence row. And maybe you see a few of the cattle down by the pond, which is a man-made pond. Some of the fencing that we've done since we retired. And then right in the old roadway here is one of the walnut stumps from one of the walnut trees we cut down that's been used to build the furniture that's in the house where Elise and I are living now, some that we have given away too. And it was the largest of the trees and almost in the middle of the roadway, so for sure you get some idea what a 50 or 60 year old walnut tree can grow to in 50 to 60 years.
Dad, now you know that this is 50 to 60 years old because
I know it was used as a road in 1921.
So this tree came about after that.
For sure.
And about how many inches across the base do you think that tree is?
I would say it's 20 inches.
20 inches. So out on the plantation then, 50 years from now, it would be easy to have that kind of a
I
tree.
would think so.
And a lot of the furniture in the house came out of this very tree,
That's
huh?
right. It was one of the better trees that we cut down. Not free for 17 feet. Good specimen.
Would there have been 2 saw logs in there then?
I
At
believe
17 feet?
we got 2 saw logs out of it.
Mhm.
2 good ones. It's 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, 12 feet long. Came out of this tree. It's a beautiful piece of walnut.
This is a very picturesque view of the barn and the Ingram barn in the background, and the location of the Booker place and the road as it went further north through the property. We're on top of the hill looking at the back of the barn, and we want to come around and show the location of the plantation, but first the walnut plantation, but first we turn to the left and we begin to see the Booker place off in the background and the tenant house.
I'll take a drink to spit it out.
And there's 2 little grandsons talking in the background, Douglas and Stephen Bingham. And the location of the road that we were talking about last is directly in front of us now where the cows are. And as we come around, we begin to see some of the rest of the property that is being cleared from fence rows. And the beautiful hill that Dad has recovered in the last 5 years or so. And now we take a second look at the hill and the huge tree up on the hill where we always go for picnics. You can see the table underneath the big tree and the orchard. And then off to our right, as we continue to turn around, is the walnut plantation. And you can see the strips which come from the most recent planting, but in the background is the original planting. Dad, where did you get the idea for this walnut plantation?
Well, the idea for planting walnut trees on this farm kind of grew as the years approached for our retirement. We knew we had a small acreage here that would be extremely hard to make a profit on in the normal kind of agricultural activities. And the only things we could do would be truck farming and dairy farming, and being retired we didn't desire to do either of those, so we decided we'd try to plant walnut trees. The idea being that as they grew to produce nuts, the nuts would have a value of at least 5 cents a pound, and as the trees grew into walnut timber they would have considerable value. And we undertook to plant a full 20 acres that you're looking at right now. We started this project in 1976 by first planting nuts into the ground about 3 inches deep and about 10 feet apart. And lo and behold, we'd plant them one day and the gray squirrels would come dig them up that night. So then we got the idea of taking walnuts and planting them in our farm garden in town and cultivate them just like a row crop. And this was very successful. And the original planting was trees grown in the garden at home, about 1,300 planted in 78. I believe that's right. And then we continued this for another year and planted about 1,400. And then the Tennessee Forestry Service became interested in this project and actually started growing walnut seedlings at their plantation over close to Jackson. And we were able to secure 4,000 trees from them 2 years in a row in 1982 and 1983. And these were our last plantings. And the most recent planting has suffered considerably from 2 years of drought, put the trees under stress, and then this past winter of a severe freeze at 17 below zero but we still want to have plenty of trees there to leave at least 100 trees per acre. Right now we've got about 430 per acre planted there, and we'll eventually thin these down to 100 or less per acre, depending on what we learn about growing trees on this type of land and in this concentration and for this purpose, which is to produce nuts and timber, we hope.
Okay, we're talking to Douglas and Stephen Bingham with their grandpa. And Grandpa, what have you got in mind for these two boys about 30 years from now when they're looking at this walnut plantation?
Well, hopefully when my grandchildren walk in here 30 or 40 years from now, they're going to see these trees about 20 inches in diameter, some 17-foot saw log in here, and there's lots of nuts covering the ground. And they can come in here and pick these nuts up and sell them and get money to go to college on. And then later on they sell these saw logs and have more money to do things. Hopefully the plantation will be perpetual and the trees will be replanted when they're harvested. And we'll wind up here with something really worth leaving to future generations. And that's one of the reasons that we have planted this, that I personally, Ellie's too, feels that my generation has used more than its fair share of this Earth's natural resources, and it's just a small legacy and a small effort on our part to leave future generations some renewable natural resource. And we have had quite a bit of activity here in that we have pruned some of these trees already. You can see here where we've taken off a lower limb that would have to come off to assure that the tree has a 14-foot saw log. And you can see the shape of this tree. Later on we'll probably take this limb off, leaving that one, and eventually wind up with a 17-foot saw log. And we're getting some pretty good length on these trees now, as you can see by the one second away from here, going on up pretty high. And as you circle around and look down the way, you can see where we've taken off limbs on a good many of these trees.
Now this part that we're standing in now was actually the first planting, is that correct?
The first planting that we made.
And when were they?
77.
1977.
1978. 77 planting was a failure, 78. And these are mostly from nuts picked up on the farm, grown in our garden, where we planted them just like you would a vegetable crop and cultivated them, dropping some corn to identify the rows for early cultivation. Went to my barber shop and got human hair and dropped in the rows to scare the squirrels away. But the Forest Service volunteered to help plant these trees, and they spent several days in here during rainy weather helping to plant these trees.
That's where we got the story about planting trees with corn, human hair, and Roundup. What do you use the Roundup for?
See the Roundup right here. We've already sprayed around this tree and killed the grass. And the idea of killing the grass around all of these trees is to give the tree itself the moisture and the nutrition that's in the soil. And every other one of these rows going up and down this way has been fertilized this year with about a pound of triple 15 fertilizer. Later on, perhaps when the trees green up, we'll be able to see a difference between one row and another and determine whether or not the fertilization is doing any good.
So we would be standing in one row looking up the hill.
That's right. Fertilized, and the next one wasn't.
And the next one would not be fertilized.
When you go to the middle of the field where the 78 planting is separated from the 79 planting, you'll find one point row, we call it, in there. And on each side of that point row was fertilized, and then every other row after that was fertilized. And the point row was not fertilized. The row just to one side of that was fertilized, and so was every other row, with a cup full of triple 15, which is close to a pound, sprinkled around the drip line, which is about the area that's been killed with Roundup.
Now there's one tree out here in front of us, as are several others, that have a twine around the twigs. Why is that there?
Okay, that tree you're looking at had multiple forks in it, and none of them looked like it would be dominant enough to grow into a straight tree. So what I've done is picked out the one most likely to be prominent and tied it over the center of the tree and clipped the other two so that the predominant one will grow faster and perhaps take over and eventually become a straight tree and develop into a saw log. And if you look at this, if you want to, real close, you can see what a multiple fork is like.
Uh-huh.
You know, what I actually did, this is just a limb off of one tree, but what I actually did was clip these two and then take this string and tie this predominant one back so that it would grow up to be perhaps straight in the future.
I see that there are some leaves on some of the trees, yet they're brown. What's happened?
What's actually happened is that on Tuesday, Monday night, we had 27 degrees temperature in this area here, and these little leaves that were beginning to grow were killed. They are dead and brittle. They will recover, and the tree will come on out and put on new leaves and all, but very definitely it slowed the growth of the trees and slowed them down for this year's growth. And this is not the first time this has happened to this plantation. And that's the reason so many of these trees have multiple crowns, is that the bud has been nipped after it started to grow and caused the tree to fork out. There's a number of these that's forked out that way, but we're not too worried about it because although this one has kind of a multiple fork, this leader will probably take over and be okay. And then just off to the side there is one that for sure has got a good straight growth on it. And you want to remember that 75% of the trees in this area, in this plantation, will eventually be thinned out to make room for the best nut-producing, best timber-producing trees. And as you look at this grass now, you can see how fertile this land is, and the plans we have is that in the future you'll bring cattle or some grazing animals in here like in September before the nuts begin to fall, and you'll graze all this down to bare ground, not unlike a golf course. Then you'll come in here with a machine like a rock picker or even a unit that picks up golf balls and pick up the walnuts and haul them and go out of the field with a truckload of nuts ready for the market.
Dad, how many trees do you figure you've got planted now in this plantation?
Well, we have about 20 acres planted in this plantation, and the trees are exactly 10 feet apart in every direction, checked off. And that's 430 trees per acre. We have about 94% survival. So we have between 8,000 and 10,000 live trees in these 20 acres now.
I was getting a lot of competition with this filming. You can see these two little boys playing in the back of this truck. They're having the time of their life on Grandpa's walnut plantation.
And many more to come, I hope.
What is the value of this plantation in your opinion?
Asking about the future value of it, what we're looking at is a nut and timber producing unit here. We kind of hoping that we'll have a maximum of 100 nut producing trees per acre, being excellent bottom land here. And we believe that on average each tree will produce 25 pounds of nut each year, and that these nuts will be valued at least 5 cents per pound, and perhaps as much as 10. There's many uses for the hard part of the walnut. As far as timber is concerned, that's sort of the $64 question. We have had some native walnuts on the tree to be offered to be purchased at $100 per tree, and they weren't excellent specimens. We've read of trees that will sell for several $1,000s per tree, up to even $25,000 per tree, but you're talking about a 100-year-old tree or such. But we see a possible timber growth of $250 per acre. That's a number that the Forest Service gave us when we started this project. feel like that's an optimistic number, and if that is true, there's hardly any crop you can grow that will net you that kind of money per acre per year. But we have high hopes for it, and there's not a lot of work required to take care of this from now on. There'll be some pruning to do in the future, and there'll be considerable thinning to do in the future, but all of these are rather minor projects and just actually take a very few hours per acre to do. It's mostly just to be patient and let them grow to maturity. Hope for good weather conditions and that the good Lord's with us all the way.
Have you found this plantation to be a real enjoyment in your retirement?
I surely have. I retired at age 63 after completing 41 years with Monsanto. I was in good physical condition and undertook this project with a lot of vigor, and it's been a real joy to do the work. It's been excellent recreation. It's been beneficial because of the exercise I got out of it. It's not all that easy to come here with post hole diggers and dig a hole and then come in and plant a tree and then come back walking and spray to kill the grass around these trees. But every day of it's been a real pleasure to me. And as I look down the road, I just hope that what we've done here is not to create a white elephant that will become a burden to LEs or to my children in the future. And most of all, I really pray that this project out here and the farm itself will never cause a conflict between my wife and our children or between any of our children. We just hope that it'll be blessed and it will grow into a benefit future generations, not only the ones that's playing in the truck back here, but others that may come along after that.
Think about 40 years from now. What is your vision of the future with regard to this plantation?
Well, I'm thinking now back in 1953 when we were out in Idaho on a temporary assignment, and on our way back home we went through California and went through the redwood forests there. And there was numerous plantations that was being maintained because of its beauty and its value. And there was just hundreds of people traveling through that area and looking at the trees and finding inspiration and realizing that the beauty and the value. And I remember you, Barry, looking up at one of those big redwood trees and looking up to me and saying, did God really do this? And along the road, in 40 years from now, I hope that future generations can come in and walk through this little plantation and realize some of the emotion, some of the inspiration that I had on this visit in California some 30 years ago.
And so the end of the history of a small legacy. A legacy being passed on from one generation to the next, begun in the 70s by Walter Bingham and his wife, Elise.